Folks, so today I'd like to make a video that's basically focused on photography because I've been involved in taking a lot of videos, as you may or may not know if you look over my channel. I have had this channel going despite the fact that it isn't taking much interest among the public compared to channels that get 256K views for a video within the first 5 days. Most of my videos have less than 100 views in a week, certainly. Over time, they will accumulate a relatively decent amount of views, but at a rate that's much lower than most other channels on YouTube. So it's been an interesting experience, but it doesn't hinder me from my true passion in terms of video, which is to play golf at different courses and experience different courses and document my golf experience. In one way, though, it has been also interesting and plays into my interest in photography and also my professional interest in video editing and photography in general. Image quality, as it were, is more or less a traditional concern of the quote-unquote amateur person who is interested in taking decent photos, but doesn't necessarily sell them or make money from them. And YouTube is interesting in that regard also because it allows me to talk with other people who are also into photography. But as time has shown us over the past 20 years, I would say 25 years, since I got into photography more or less intensely, we've seen a major change in the market where, say, in the film days, people would use either a camera that had a roll of film, and it would be placed into the side of the camera in the handle, and you'd roll the film over the shutter where the lens lets light down to the film, and it would go to a pickup roll on the right side. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about this stuff. I just want to say that basically historically there have been two types of film cameras, and those two types of film cameras turned into digital cameras, and then the market moved to digital more or less, because there always have been some film shooters, there always will be film shooters. And we have what we call the 35 millimeter film format, and then there's other formats, 8 millimeter video and so forth. And the large format cameras, which I don't remember exactly what the equivalent is in 35 millimeter for, say, like a Hasselblad or something like that, which is technically called a large format camera. And so over time, everything has a digital element in the sense that every market has a digital element, okay? That was a film format originally because they just put a digital sensor behind the lens and to replace the film. And over time, the camera market has shrunk down below 35 millimeter film cameras like Kodak rolls or Fujifilm or things like that to where now we have a cell phone camera market, which is piggybacked on the cell phone market. Okay, so I have over time started to use my cell phone camera to take pictures of golf courses instead of carrying around either a subframe or a full frame camera, but basically the same format, whether it's APS-C or 35 millimeter. It's generally been the same format because a lot of the subframe bodies evolved out of 35 millimeter bodies. And only in the sense of moving to mirrorless have the 35 millimeter and APS-C markets switched to smaller bodies. What had generally happened was that they switched to smaller sensors, which allowed them to put much larger focal length ranges, zoom ranges, and so forth, or primes that were much smaller on a APS-C size body compared to the full frame lenses that were used with film. So I'm assuming that you know most of the relevant details to photography, to IQ examination and comparisons, which would mark you as somebody who's been involved in the very camera gear that I'm talking about. And as we start to really move to a cell phone camera based society, assuming that we have not already done so, and we stop using 35 millimeter or APS-C sized sensors to take pictures out in broad daylight, where largely you either are using very low noise ISO settings and almost no noise reduction in broad daylight, or you're using a large lens with, say, like a 200 to 400 millimeter focal length range and 35 millimeter, then that supports taking shots handheld without tripods, because you can use the medium ISO, say 400 to 800, maybe 1600 ISO with these new cameras, because they're a lot lower noise and higher image fidelity than you would get with a small, like 1/3 or 1/4 inch diagonal sensor that you'd find in a bridge camera. So after my experiences shooting HDR shots at the Grand Canyon and finding out that my D850 really did not really work well shooting HDR blended shots, okay, which is where you take a series of HDR shots and you stack them to form an HDR image. And the D850 has an HDR blend mode where it does that for you automatically. You know, you can set it up and it'll automatically, or can automatically, or you can control it to some degree. Take these shots that have different exposures, and it uses an electronic shutter in the D850 to take these bracket shots and then blends it inside the camera. And where I realized that while it was a neat feature to have, and it's one of the things that my cell phone, my Google 6A supports, it's a neat feature to have, but that the execution of it and the resulting IQ depends on how well that's done in the camera. And I discovered that the D850 has a tendency to slightly misalign the image and not have the best sharpness when it does HDR. It tends to work well when there's a large percentage of the shot that's set with one image, and then the other bracket exposures are only contributing internally, like in the center-ish part of the image, than it does if the whole image needs an HDR blend, and then you can see this misregistration across the entire image. So this has a problem in my D850 in that it uses an electronic shutter, and even if you're shooting at high shutter speeds, the fact that it's electronic shutter and not a full shutter, which is a manual shutter versus an electronic shutter, the electronic shutter tends to take images line by line, and a full shutter will take the whole image, then take the exposure of that one image, close the shutter, reopen the shutter, take the whole exposure, and then do blending. So my older camera, the D610, has a fully mechanical HDR mode, and my newer camera, the D850, has an electronic shutter HDR mode, and it is clear that they work differently. I have not quite nailed down the exact difference because I have not quite gone back to where I noticed the problem with my D850 and taken the same kind of shots with my D610. And there are various technical reasons why, like having to pay to go to the Grand Canyon and take these same shots and so forth and so on. I'm not really interested in going back to the Grand Canyon and taking shots at the Grand Canyon again that I got either decently with the 850 despite its issues, or I got decently with my 6A, which generally tends to work well in these situations, although it does have its own problems. So I could make up a table here and list them, but I will basically say for a basis here that the 6A has generally good blends. It's a much higher shutter speed that the cell phone cameras use than I would normally use with my DSLR. And that's partially because there's a bias towards shooting at lower ISOs for better IQ. And the cell phone has a bias for shooting at higher shutter speeds with shorter focal lengths because it's a smaller lens. It normally shoots like f1.7, whereas my D850, I would want to shoot normally at, say, f8 or f9 or higher because it's going to give me better sharpness across the entire frame. So I think that one of the problems that you need to take into consideration is with at least the D850, you want to shoot it more wide open in situations where there is higher dynamic range across the scene. And that is going to alleviate some of the issues by allowing the camera to exploit a higher frame rate. Ideally, you would think that that's what happens, though that is not necessarily what actually happens due to the limitation of using electronic shutter. So I have not experimented with that. I haven't gone and looked into that. I certainly have not gone back to a lot of the places that I had problems shooting HDR with the D850 because it doesn't always have this problem. It's not like every time you take an HDR shot with the HDR active, it's going to have misregistration, okay? Sometimes the shot is fine, honestly. And it really is a question of extremes. You need a true HDR scene to have the visible artifacts that I see with the D850 in terms of misregistration. I am not so interested in this problem that I'm going to pay $40 and drive back down to the Grand Canyon, $40 in gas plus $40 for a ticket to get back to it. So it's $80 or more just to do this. I do have places near me where I have seen this problem, extreme examples of this problem, and I may very well go there. As a matter of fact, I probably will shortly after I write this video, to go generate the same, or try to generate the same images with the D610 and see if it handles the situation better than my D850 does. Again, this is one of the problems with having different gear, is it has different strengths and weaknesses. I mean, I am definitely the kind of person who will buy different versions of the same basic thing, like golf clubs or car parts or whatever, just to see what the differences are in terms of performance and reliability and so forth are between these two different sets of hardware. And that is something that's carried me through my professional career, let's put it that way. So I did this yesterday out playing golf at Falcon Ridge, and I've taken my D610 to take shots of golf courses to examine the difference between my D6, my Pixel 6a and a D610, noting that it would probably depend on the lens that I use as much as the haze filter and the ISO and all these other kind of things. And there have been, websites, pages, groups, and so forth that looked into all these issues in great detail over the years that I've been in photography. And, I'm not that kind of person where I'm going to sit down and write a test script in Python or LabVIEW or whatever to automate these testing and build a lab where I'm going to put motorized gimbals in the lab and program the cameras to automatically configure the cameras and automatically take shots. I mean, there are sites out there that have done this very thing. So I'm not gonna spend my time and money to do that. And I understand that there are issues that fall out of that. Like a lot of people have now made not just careers, but have made a lot of money doing that. But I'm not the kind of person who's going to do that just for curiosity. Let's put it that way. But I will travel. I will take the shots. I know the benefits of lab work. And one of the problems with lab work is that you need to have an idea of where the problem is so you can start designing a test platform to test the problem that you think that you see and find out exactly what's going on. So as on the other hand, I have taken my 610 lens out with me to play golf so that I could take shots either on the road or at the course. And this has been a month or so that I've been thinking about doing this and not even taking the camera out of the bag. Sometimes I don't even take it out of the car. It's that much more work and effort to take shots with a DSLR and lens compared to taking shots with my cell phone that it is almost prohibitive that I will not use the DSLR, even if I have it on me and it's packaged. Because when I package it to take it with me out on the road, I don't want to unpack it to take a couple of shots that I've already taken with my cell phone for comparison's sake, and then repackage it, put it back in my bag, and actually then come back and compare the shots. So when I went out to Falcon Ridge yesterday to take these shots, I had to force myself to take these shots. And I also didn't want to take a bunch of shots at a bunch of different holes to compare them with. I ended up just taking shots at one hole from one place at 3 different focal lengths. I think I used a 28 millimeter wide, I have a 28 300 Tamron lens that's non-image stabilized, but it's perfectly fine for taking shots in broad daylight because I can stop it down enough to make the shots reasonably sharp across the frame. And so I did that. I shot it at f9.5 and I set the ISO to auto and let the automatic speed calculations go. And I don't know yet if there is a way to have it hold a ratio, like if your focal length is 80 millimeters, for example, that you want to take shots at least 3 times that speed, like 80 millimeters, you want to take shots at, what is 3 times 8? 24. 1/240th of a second and faster is the 1/FL relation that film or DSLR photographers normally use. You don't do that with a cell phone. Okay, 9 times out of 10, the cell phone handles all of the settings for the camera, and all you have to do is just keep taking pictures and maybe move the center point around so you get a better exposure, you get better shutter speed. But rarely do you see people taking shots with a cell phone and having even any kind of clue whatsoever of what the shutter speed and focal length are, and much less the ISO. And certainly when it uses a f1.7 f-stop number, it is seeing a lot faster shutter speeds and ISOs than I would see with a compromised lens on a DSLR. So it's almost given that the shots will be far more stable with a cell phone camera than they will be with the DSLR, which makes up for the fact that you're holding it in your hand and it flips and flops around every time you move your fingers, much less when you press the screen to release the shutter. So that's one of the advantages of a cell phone, is it's much simpler to use to get decent shots. But there is a compromise, and again, this is all part of what's driving this test. There is a compromise in the speed by which a 25 megapixel cell phone camera photograph is taken and saved to disk, because 25 megapixel bitmaps are going to be the same size regardless whether you shoot them with a DSLR or you shoot them with a cell phone. And by now, if you are not lost, you're getting about to where I'm going with this video. Okay, so your cell phone, or at least mine, my Google Pixel 6a, will save shots in one of 2 different formats, either DNG or JPEG. And it saves shots in JPEG with a lot of JPEG compression and a lot of distortion and a lot of noise reduction compared to the shots that I take with my DSLR. Okay, no question, no issue. Okay, that I see phenomenon associated with the fact that you're only going to look at it on a cell phone. Let's put it that way. And you want to take pictures as fast as possible so that you can hold it up, take the picture, put it back in your pocket. You don't want to have a lot of time in the camera processing these images. So it doesn't shoot RAW, it will shoot DNG, which is useful, but not quite as good as shooting RAW, straight image data off the sensor and saving that to a RAW format. It compromises and gives you DNG format, which is a lightly processed version of the raw data. The JPEG it supports is significantly distorted compared to the JPEGs that my D850s or any reasonable DSLR will produce at high quality. And as such, the files are much smaller, which is an issue for me considering that this cell phone has megatons of storage, okay, and can store tens of thousands of these JPEGs on it before it runs low on space. There's no reason whatsoever to shoot JPEGs on this camera at low quality and save storage. It's just, the worst they're going to be, even if there were bitmaps that we're saving, is they're going to be somewhere around 5 to 10 megabytes. I can save TIFF files out with my D850, but I can only save JPEGs out with my D610. And when I shoot HDR stack mode, I can't save RAW. It has to be some bitmap type format like TIFF or JPEG. So the irony is that I can save TIFFs with my D850, which is a 45 megapixel camera, but I can only save JPEGs with my D610, which is a 25 megapixel camera. It's almost the same resolution, but it suffers from the slightest, I will say, noticeable JPEG distortion, and has some softness from the lens and some softness from some very slight noise reduction in even the JPEGs compared to the RAW files. But it's slight. Trust me, you can see in these test shots that if I shoot RAW versus JPEG in high Q and I process the RAW files in RAW therapy, that there is the slightest difference in IQ between the two. And even then, you have to go to 100% or higher to see it. And the RAW processor is also going, in this case, RAW therapy is what I use, is also going to contribute to some degree to the difference in IQ. Okay, the level settings, sharpness, lens distortion, all that kind of stuff is going to contribute to a slight difference because it's done by RAW therapy versus done by the camera firmware. Okay, so there are going to be slight differences, and I could sit here and show you all these differences, but again, it took me 20 minutes to get to this point. So I'm not saying that this is significant when you look at full images on your cell phone, but it does become significant when you start scaling images on your 22 or your 36 or your 50-inch monitor in your house. When you're and then the other factor is, are you looking at it at 720p on your monitor, or 1080p, or 2K or 4K in the process? Because you really aren't going to see all the pixel information at lower display resolutions like 10K. So when I took these screenshots of what I have here, these might be magnified in the image viewer, assuming the image viewer itself doesn't smooth or distort the image, or the OS or the driver doesn't distort the image in any way, okay? But the fact is, I have a 720p monitor. It's a big ass TV monitor that's at least 36-inch diagonal, but it only supports 1080p and 720p in Ubuntu, and I'm not going to load another OS. I could do that. I could load Windows 10 on it and do the same thing. And I also am not going to change the monitor to get higher resolution data. So I'm showing you what is being shown at cell phone resolution on a cell phone, which is going to be somewhere like 480p, okay, on a cell phone, much smaller, but I'm showing you slightly more resolution, like 720p, on a monitor that's way bigger, and I can see the differences, but you can't. So if you look at this on your monitor, you don't see any difference whatsoever, that's understandable, okay? But what I can also see that does not depend on the resolution of the monitor is I can see differences in color and saturation and contrast and noise reduction in the image, and distortion from the sharpening that's being done in a cell phone versus the sharpening that I'm doing in GIMP or something else. So I can clearly see these differences, okay? And you should be able to see them also. So I apologize for not changing the image for 25 minutes, but there's background to this, okay? And so you can, skip through the video or whatever you want to do. But I'm just going to show this one image because I don't want to get involved in a lot of editing to make this point. So the image that I'm showing here, that I've been showing for the past 25 minutes now, is the same shot that I took with both cameras, the 6A and the D610 with this Tamron 28-300 on it. I kind of forgot to take the same shot from the same point, so it's not exactly the same perspective. You're going to see that there's a slight turn to the left on the cell phone cameras compared to the D610 shot, which is on the right here. The one is PXL, whatever, is the cell phone shot, and one that's DSC 28 blah 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 is the original process, the minimally processed version of the D610 shot, okay, at 3 different focal lengths. Now, the other problem is when I took the shots without HDR blending on, I forgot to take the long zoom shot that I took with HDR blending active. So I have 2 shots that came from RAW on the D610, and then the third one came from HDR blending. And I took both the RAW shot and then the HDR blending shot because I wanted to see the difference between what I got without using stacking, HDR stacking, and with using HDR stacking. But again, because I was just kind of half drunk and wandering through this whole issue, I forgot to take the exact same focal length shots in both modes. So I have to use the JPEG from HDR blending as an example of what is produced at the long end of the range of shots that I took. We're getting there, okay? What I did then was I took the one shot that I took with the Google 6A, and for this entire series of shots at this course, I only took shots at the non-digital zoom focal length of 24 millimeter effective. The 15 millimeter effective is really only good if you're standing right in something that's big. It's useful. It does help. It's actually quite useful because the 28 millimeter lens on my D610 does not have the field of view to match it. It's 15 millimeters effective. It just isn't going to show it if you're standing too close. And that 15 millimeter gives you a lot of flexibility to catch a lot of the scene that you can then edit out later. But the point is, if you crop out the sides and top and bottom of the 24 millimeter effective shot, which is the 1x non-zoom setting in the 6A, okay, you are cropping into a wide angle shot to get that field of view down to whatever it is the equivalent effective focal length is in 35 millimeter. And that should have a effect on the IQ. Theoretically it should. Just as if you were to use the 2x zoom instead. And I definitely can see blocking and in the 2x zoom shots, which is one reason I don't like using it unless I absolutely have to, which I never have to absolutely use it because 9 times out of 10 I can drive out further down the course and take the same shot without the 2x zoom. So it's just a matter of finding where I took shots and then actually taking the shot that looks better. But if you were to stay in one place and take the shot and you wanted to zoom in, you use the 2x zoom. And this is on the 6A, and this is the issue that I wanted to see what I could do with IQ if I did crop the 1x zoom, the standard 24 millimeter effective, compared to what I would get if I use a DSLR and a zoom lens. Okay, and long story short story slightly more interesting, there's very little degradation in the IQ relative to the original 24 millimeter effective shot as I crop it. And the wider angle angled shot that I took with the D610 and the Tamron 28-300 was only 45 millimeter effective. Okay, so I went from 28 millimeter effective to maybe 30 millimeter effective to 40, and then the longest one I took was 45 millimeter, and that cut the field of view down to about 20% of what it was at 28 millimeter. And you can go online and find the equations. There are people who have made sites with, I forget the software that you use for this crap now, because I don't use it anymore, that basically will do the calculations for you on a website. And it's a shame that I forgot exactly what Java, yeah. So, or PHP or whatever. So there's no question that there is a interest. I definitely have an interest in being able to zoom in to get the field of view that I want for a shot. And what I've shown for this particular scene, this hole, is that I can zoom in and not really even increase the shutter speed and ISO that I need to use. I mean, I think that the camera took these 3 shots at the same shutter speed and slightly different ISO. I think it went from like 100 to 150. While the focal length doubled or almost doubled across that range. And so you see, as I zoom in and I zoom in on the shot, okay, so I would go from, say, 8% magnification or scaling in the image viewer at 28 millimeter. I can go to 50, 100%, 300%, 500%, right? But you're never really going to get to where you need more than 100 and 150 percent magnification to get the focal length field of view that you want with a wide angle shot. That's what I've discovered, okay? As long as I'm taking pictures of the course and not of the background, the mountains or whatever, I'm not going to use a lot of magnification, either the lens or in the image viewer or in the crop. And over that range, the difference in IQ of the cell phone shot at 1x was negligible, in my opinion. The only difference that I saw was when I went to zooms out past 100%. And then all of the IQ flaws of the cell phone image just leapt out, okay? There's a point where it's almost as good. It's certainly functional, it's usable, it's close enough to what the DSLR and the 28 millimeter lens it produces. As long as your zoom factor and scaling factor in the image viewer is low enough, and the smaller that the display that you use to look at the image, the more you can scale it out in the image viewer and still see an acceptable image. And I'm not going to admit this, it depends on who is looking at it and what the subject is, okay, and the IQ of the original image, but basically you're not going to see much of a degradation relative to the original image at low scaling as you scale into the image in your image viewer or crop into the image with an external editor, as long as you don't crop it a lot, as long as you don't zoom in a lot, okay? And people tend to do that kind of stuff mainly because they're looking for flaws. And that's how good cameras are these days. And they've been that good for a long time. They were better, certainly better in the DSLR days compared to, say, a bridge camera, which is using really shitty sensor and heavy IQ and has a lot of noise that the camera is filtering out with IQ. Or even if you shoot it raw, you still have to go in and filter out all the luminance noise and chroma noise that you're going to see. Even if you're using a CMOS sensor, you're still going to see a lot of luminance noise, okay? So the problem is that the larger sensor cameras like APS-C and 35 millimeter are going to give you a decent quality raw image off the bat at lowest ISO. There's certainly even a CCD APS-C camera is going to give you a decent image at ISO 100 or 200, maybe even 400 in a pinch, okay? But there are the differences between between CCD and CMOS at APS-C at 400. 400, 800, you're going to get a lot of noise. And trust me, I've been there and done this, okay? You're going to get significant noise even shooting in daylight at ISO 400, 800, where you will not want to go further with that image without applying noise reduction if you care about the IQ, because you're either going to see the noise or you're going to lose resolution when you apply noise reduction to get the noise down to an acceptable level. With a full frame camera, you do get an extra stop or two of ISO before that becomes a problem. And you trade off that 1.4 crop factor for that improved noise, I guess SNR, okay, compared to an APS-C. There is a real benefit to shooting full frames in daylight compared to APS-C, because in an outdoor scene, you aren't always shooting high exposure scenes. Sometimes there's shadow, sometimes, you know, the light is not optimal for that particular part, and you're going to see parts of the scene where there are shadowy sections, and you are going to see noise at ISO 400 even in those scenes. It's just the way the world works, especially if you're using this old CCD APS-C camera. So the question then is, where does this crop up in cell phone cameras? Where is that threshold where you can use it versus you can't use it? It's just hideous. And as you see here in this particular image, especially in a large format display, it's very easy to see the IQ advantage of a DSLR and a zoom lens versus using a cell phone camera like the 6A and cropping the image down, okay? The cropping itself generates a vast amount of distortion, but the distortion is largely coming from the processing that goes on in the camera and the JPEG file that it produces, not the cropping. The more that you crop an image down, you start to see distortion from pixelization and from inherent lens issues, and there's almost no lens issue in a cell phone camera these days. Okay, certainly not a decent cell phone camera like the 6A. What you see is the distortion from the image processing that is converting the raw image data down to JPEG format in this camera's configuration of the JPEG format, and also whatever noise reduction it's also doing, and sharpening, and the color modification. Basically, all the image processing that's happening in the camera is creating this distortion. And it becomes very, very evident when you compare it to a DSLR that doesn't do nearly as much image processing as a cell phone does. But you do see the color differences, and one of the advantages of the 6A is it does produce decent color. It's not bad as far as the parts that you can see at a 480p format. It gives really nice color. It's one of the reasons I like using it to take pictures. And I've been using it to take pictures of my golf trips for a long time now, for probably, I bought it a year ago, roughly, okay, and I've pretty much been using it almost exclusively to take shots when I go play golf. So it's important to understand that the shift to cell phone cameras from DSLRs and other cameras has not happened without a good reason. It's not happened just because they're small and light and rugged relative to DSLR gear and easy to carry. You carry it on you all the time, and it's much more likely to be with you when you're out walking around than even if you take a DSLR and lens out in the field. It's still not like you're going to automatically, lift it up, take the lens cap off, turn the camera on, set up the camera, and take pictures, even though that's relatively painless, taking pictures with it. It's carrying it and stowing it and unstowing it. That's the problem. And I can only tell you from experience that it's quite adequate at taking pictures in exchange for the comfortable nature and the ease of use and the fact that you always have it on you. It doesn't sacrifice a whole lot for that, but it does sacrifice noticeable IQ differences between it and a DSLR if you go looking for them. And some people do. Some people need to have a certain level of IQ. They can't rely on a cell phone, and I completely agree with that. And some people don't like the image processing that a particular cell phone does, and the 6A is notorious for offending photographers who want scene fidelity in the images. And I think it's definitely tuned more towards the larger market, which doesn't necessarily look for scene fidelity. It's looking for a good looking scene. And this is an issue that's gone back and forth over the photography realm since Sony started cooking the raw data that came out of their camera. We got way back and way back to the point where you couldn't get that raw data out of a Sony camera. I've owned old enough cameras from Sony that didn't have Cook RAW. And I can tell you from experience that it is noticeable, the difference between the raw data coming out of, I think it was an A700, or maybe it was the A7, I think. The Minolta version of that Sony rebranded to sell as a Sony DSLR. I had the original Konica Minolta version before that camera. I've had that camera, and I've had cameras that Sony made after that did have Cook RAW. And I've seen a lot of cameras, a lot of Canon cameras that have lower degrees of Cook RAW. Okay, it's very rare that you're going to get a Canon that has no Cook RAW whatsoever. And I think even Nikon does some very, very, very light cooking of the raw data in their raw files, or at least Raw Therapy does. And like I said, if you keep digging down deeper and deeper and deeper into the image, you will find issues with the image, no matter what gear you use. It could be $9,000 Hasselblad gear. You're still going to find problems with it. The thing that stops people from doing that is it isn't necessary, and it takes time, and it's distracting. I just took up 45 minutes of your time talking about this one problem. But I'm telling you, at least with this one particular camera, the 6A, it's really not an issue. And you can shoot it at 1x almost all the time. And as long as you get the scene that you're looking for, where you don't need to go to wide angle, don't worry about it. You can crop the shots later and get decent quality. As decent quality as you would have gotten at 1x. And when that blows up and it suddenly becomes just total nonsense, that's when you're cropping it too hard. Take my word on it.